Hello, my name is Miko, or you can call me Miko, whichever you prefer. And let me ask you a question. Have you read a book in your life that bored you so much that you physically just couldn't stand it anymore? And you might be wondering, Miko, why even finish the book in the first place if you hated it so much? Listen, I have a pet peeve where I can't start another book without finishing the one that I'm already reading. I just can't do it. But that book for me was Last Days by Adam Neville, which is about a filmmaker and his crew who unravel the mysteries of a mysterious fictional cult back in the 70s. You might recognize Mr. Neville from his other book, The Ritual, which was adapted into a Netflix movie around 2017, and it scared me so much as a child, but today we're not going to be talking about that. Today we are going to be reading Last Days. Now, I read this book over a couple of months because I took a big break in between, so forgive me if I miss any details for anyone that actually liked this book. But if I do, just feel free to correct me or add whatever I missed. I actually did go back and reread most of the important parts of the book, which made me want to cry because I had to remember all the pain and suffering that I had to go through reading it. Also, this is a spoiler warning because I will be spoiling the whole book. Now, don't get me wrong, if you love very, very, very slow burn horror books, this book is right up your alley. But if you don't like reading page after page of monologuing and info dumping, I would suggest putting this book back on the shelf. With that out of the way, we have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Our story starts out, as every story does, with our main protagonist Kyle and his film crew. Kyle is the director, Dan is the lights, sound, and camera, and Finger Mouse, yes, his name is really Finger Mouse, is the editor. Now, things are not going well for them business-wise. With no income and their previous producer stealing all of their work, they are pretty much almost bankrupt at this point. Kyle is desperate for any job he can take. Until one day, Kyle receives an opportunity of a lifetime by this big-time producer, Maximilian Solomon. Now, Max is a funky and mysterious guy, offering Kyle and his crew up to $300,000 to interview, film, edit, and release this documentary about this cult of the last days. Kyle is, of course, just a little bit skeptical of the offer at first, but he has no money, so he's gonna go for it anyways. And at this point, Kyle is kind of realizing that there must be a catch to all of this. And the catch is that he has to produce it within 2 weeks. But that's just what Max wants him to think. After stopping by a few bars, Kyle tells his crew about the insane job opportunity that he was just given, and they just go interview the first person after that. Now, this is where it starts going downhill. The interviews in most of the book are way longer than I think they should have been. 2/3 of the book is basically just a rinse and repeat of interviewing and something paranormal happening, which I don't necessarily mind. It's just that it got very repetitive after a while. The first survivor they interview is this strange hippie woman, Susan White. Kyle spoke to repress his urge to grin. "Hi, Susan, or do you prefer Sister Isis?" Her small, brittle body turned and lurched at him. He extended in rebuke. Crystals drooped from her scrawny neck and chimed together, the sound accompanied by that wood bracelet rattling on her thin wrists. "Never call me that." And they interview her at the first location of the cult's origin, the house on Clarendon Road, which is kind of like an apartment complex. She basically goes on to tell them how their leader Catherine was very manipulative and controlling. Susan starts talking about the renunciation, which I assume is basically how Catherine knew everything about everybody. What is it? The renunciation. Susan held 2 hands in the air as if she hadn't heard Kyle. He still wasn't sure if she would play up like this for the camera or whether she was just so eccentric that she already was oblivious to what a freak show she would be on screen. She presided over everything, every session, listening, always listening, assessing us, gathering intelligence, things she could use, later against us. I have never forgiven her. I knew it would end badly for her. Other than that, they didn't get too much more information out of Susan other than there was something supernatural about this cult, and that Sister Catherine was definitely up to something. After the interview, Susan leaves and the crew wait for the nighttime to get some ambient shots for their background. While they explore, they set up cameras all around the building to see if they can catch anything that creeps in the darkness. Sooner or later, they come across the basement and are like, yeah, let's go and film stuff in the basement, cause it's a basement, and why wouldn't you go to the basement? And while they're down there setting up their equipment, they start noticing this very strange smell. And they're looking around trying to find out what's causing this smell until they notice this really weird mold growing on the wall. This mold is like bigger and grosser than regular mold. I'm not really sure. It's very hard to describe based on what's said in the book. The wall, something's leaking, see? Upon the murky plaster, a dim cloud of damp, as wide and as long as the door, was stretched with thicker brown veins of moisture that shone wetly. As Kyle looked at it, the amazement intensified about his face. I'd better call Max to call the estate agents. Pipes burst. That wasn't there earlier. I'd have smelt it when I came down this afternoon. Maybe I don't have such an imaginative imagination, but it was really hard for me to build a picture of what this mold looked like in my head. I kind of imagined it with like human limbs and like fingers like growing out of it. I really don't know. Anyways, they're examining this mold, seeing how weird and smelly it looks, when suddenly they hear something come from the top floor. And they decide to check it out. And they do it for the footage, which is like, I guess A+ for effort, but like, is it worth it? While on their way to the top floor where the sounds were coming from, they come across a corridor. And honestly, I'm not gonna lie, this was probably the most intense part of the book, besides, I guess, the ending. But it was probably because it was the first supernatural interaction that we had with this entity or whatever. A distant burst of whistles, interspersed with a sound reminiscent of a gargle heard through the wall, followed by a few seconds later, a dog whining. They stood mute and immobile until suddenly a lump of feet raced through the unlit hallway of the penthouse and broke them from paralysis. For a moment, they became trapped against each other from within the doorframe. Dan's elbow knocked against Kyle's shoulder. "He's pushing me behind him!" Panic surged to fill Kyle's head with a jostle of thoughtless thought, and the image of Susan White's lined, lipless mouth saying, "Presences." But they start hearing the sounds of clawed feet on a tiled floor as they're running away out of this apartment. As they start to panic, they start hearing all sorts of noises and sounds, but specifically a pig's snort, which is important later. A sudden rush of air from above dropped throughout the middle of the stairwell they rounded like frightened children. It felt like a long hiss, and preceded what Kyle thought as the grunt of a pig. And they just start running for their lives as this clawed creature chases after them. They manage to escape with little damage and brush it off as nothing happened. And the next morning, they're just chilling in their apartment, smoking cigarettes and watching the footage from the previous night. After more unnecessary dialogue and whatnot, they head to bed and Kyle starts getting these nightmares about the cult. And he starts noticing that he sees the same mold that was in the basement growing in his apartment. Confused and angry, he calls Max and is like, "What is going on?" And Max low-key gaslights him and is like, "It's fine. There's nothing to worry about." And they're just off to their next interview. The next interview is taking place in a small village in France with our next survivor, Gabriel. Now, Gabriel is more of a closed-off man. He doesn't like talking to people. He wants to get this over with. He's very jittery at times. Kyle and Dan set up the cameras while Gabriel insists on speaking to Max. But Kyle's like, "Sorry, there's no signal out here." And obviously, Gabriel is an anxious mess, being back at the location where he once was. But all in all, he agrees to continue filming and explains how most of the people in the cult were treated as livestock. The children born at the farm were put into communal care immediately after birth. The infants were kept in handmade cribs, though. The other children slept on mattresses, Gabriel offered, as if it was an excuse. In a terrible building with dogs? Jesus, Dan said to himself. Anyways, they go to film in this really creepy temple, and Kyle, while they are filming, feels something across his back. Something in Gabriel triggers halfway, and he gets frightened and runs out the door. So Dan goes and runs after him in an attempt to get him back, while Kyle just goes on filming and exploring the place. Like, why aren't you helping? Anyways, he decides to go to Catherine's house, which is like more of a secluded area. And her house was exclusive to her and her 7 followers. They are called the 7. They're basically just Catherine's favorite followers, and they have a higher status in the cult than everybody else. Gabriel also mentions during his interview that Catherine had the most luxurious rooms and buildings that she would stay in, while her followers, on the other hand, would sleep in barns and tents. As Kyle heads to the 2nd floor of Catherine's house to get some more ambient shots, he finds Catherine's room, which has begun to wear away from all the many years. The room is clearly filthy and trashed, and for some reason Kyle sits on the bed. And as he does, he notices something oozing out from under his butt. He jumps up and is like, ew, oh my god, what the hell is this? And as he's examining the bed closer, he notices that the sheets are moving. And instead of leaving and getting the hell out of there, he decides to lift the bedspread to find a bunch of snakes slithering in the bed. In disgust, he stumbles back and falls, and suddenly he hears the front door from downstairs slam shut. He thinks it's Dan, and he's shouting Dan's name because Dan was supposed to bring more filming equipment, and of course there's no response because it's not Dan. He could barely feel his legs, let alone the camera and equipment he clutched with his shaking hands. Paralyzed with fear, he waited for 20 minutes after the noises of intrusion had abruptly stopped downstairs. But the sudden silence left an image in his mind of a small, thin figure standing at the foot of the staircase that looked up and waited for him to come down. And so Kyle hears this sound, and then after that it just immediately cuts to him walking back to the houses where they originally filmed at. And when he gets back, there's no sign of Gabriel or Dan anywhere. And he's like, I wonder, where did they go? And so Kyle backtracks to the field that they came across, and in the distance he sees Dan walking very slowly and very carefully throughout the grass. And Kyle is like, what's going on here? And Dan yells back to him that there are traps set in the field, and that Gabriel had accidentally stepped on one. So then it cuts to Gabriel, and they're rushing him to the hospital, and they amputate his leg, which is kind of extreme, but I guess, I mean, I don't know what happens when you step on a bear trap, but I guess. I mean, is that what you do when someone steps on a bear trap? Anyways, Kyle and Dan are visibly shaken at this, and they call Max again. Kyle had then called Max from the car park. Kyle spat through the phone about the bloody traps you had us walk through. Eventually, in a faint, tired voice, Max had said, "The path. I had told you to stay on the path." And then right before Max ends the call, he drops the absolute bombshell that Susan White is dead. And then after that, a bunch of more just random things happen where they're like, oh my god, I can't believe that happened. And oh my god, did you hear that too? As they take a look at their footage. And I'm sitting there bored out of my mind reading this. Anyways, that night, Kyle has another strange vision or nightmare. In the bathroom, he stared at himself under the welcome explosion of vanilla light from the spotless mirror. He raised his wet face and turned back into the darkened doorway that led into the room and the bed that he did not want to sleep in anymore. But turning towards the door, he glimpsed something in the mirror. A smudgy reflection of a mark on the wall opposite the wash basin. Kyle turned, moved to the series of dirty streaks above the towel rack, shivered from what he assured himself was the cold of the tiles beneath his naked soles, tingling up his legs and across his goosing flesh. and not because of what he assumed was the outline of a bony thing with 4 skeletal legs on the wall. Soon after, Kyle actually meets Max face to face in his penthouse to discuss the film further. And Max is rich. He is very wealthy, and when he answers the door, he's dressed in a velvet dressing gown, okay? This man is stacked with paper. One odd thing that Kyle notices about Max's penthouse is the odd fluorescent lights everywhere that just so happen to be on all the time. Now, the lights are going to be very important later on. They continue to discuss what happened to Gabriel and the next interviewee that they're going to interview when Max drops another bombshell that Max was actually the founder of the cult. And at first, Kyle is mad about this, but after a while, he just becomes chill with it and just continues working for Max for some reason. A bunch of exposition happens during this part and the next interview, and I'm pretty sure none of it is important. It's mostly just Kyle being like, ugh, why are we doing this? Why? Oh my god, why? It's dangerous, but we need the money. Other than that, he mentions to Dan that he got touched back in the temple when they were filming with Gabriel. Max, he asked me if I had been touched. Touched? Why would he be asking you that? Kyle looked at Dan. I thought something was in the temple. Felt like something ran at me in the dark, and I felt something on my neck. And so anyways, they hop on a plane for their next interview in Arizona. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but most of the book is set in London, so they're always going to pubs and smoking cigarettes. But anyways, the next location that they are filming at is at this little ranch in Arizona called the Blue Copper Mine. Here they're supposed to meet with a former police officer, Lieutenant Conaway, who investigated the crime scene at the ranch when the cult went full-blown drink the Kool-Aid. Kyle and Dan set up the cameras while Lieutenant Conaway explains how he was the first responder and heard the gunshots from the ranch. A minute passed. Call come into my car, Unit 27. So there I set out with my partner Jimenez just after 11. Once we were off the highway, we never set eyes on a single vehicle the whole way out. We get down off that road a little ways and we see the smoke too. Like mist with some dirty yellow in it, what was left of it, like it was dying out. It was a flare, I reckon, but it was quiet except for the dogs. So of course it sounds like a strange story, as Conaway tells them about how he heard dogs from the sky. When they arrive at the ranch, it's dead silent, and they end up wandering around a little bit and end up in this white building, where they see many cult members laying dead on the floor. They call the paramedics and search the camp for any more survivors, and move into another building where Conaway tells them what happened in the camp. In this building we found the killer, Brother Belial, although we didn't know his name that night. It was the smallest of the remaining structures, no bigger than a tool shed. Door was closed, but we could hear a man praying inside. Least it sounded like praying. And he didn't stop when we challenged him through the door. So Jimenez kicked it in and shone his torch through, right into his face, which I'll never forget. This guy was bearded and wearing a dirty robe. His robes kinda blended in with the wood right there, so all we could see clearly was his face. Real wild looking. Seen the same thing on junkies. And he just sat there talking to himself. To God, I ain't sure. Couldn't get a reaction out of him. Then Jimenez seen his hands. They were covered in blood. So me and my partner reckon, at around the exact same time, that this here mumbling fool was probably the killer. Which he was. The camp was basically just a mess of a crime scene with bodies everywhere. Some of the victims actually tried to escape the area, as some of the officers found them near the fence with teeth marks in them. But later, they recognized that these aren't animal teeth marks. These are human teeth marks. After the interview, there's a jump cut to this older interview or this report of the family who called the police on the ranch, and it's basically interviewing their son Emilio. People would come through asking for directions because they heard about the mine and the community down there. They came in cars and buses for a while, something new and exciting. Others were running away, from bad homes, things like that. He told us that he would come across the temple people in the desert too. He took people from the city on trail rides through the foothills and to the Longwa Mountains. It was the only work there for him then. My father found the temple people to be very strange. They were always polite, friendly, but they would preach too much. And Emilio would kind of tell these stories about his father's interaction with the temple people. The day Emilio's father called the police on the mine, he goes to stay up on this hill a little further away to see if he could see anything happening. And he said that he heard dogs barking and whining from the sky. That night, Kyle has another nightmare, which isn't really important, but I just thought I'd throw that in there. The next person they interview is Homicide Detective Hank Sweeney, who runs them through the whole case from start to finish. Hank also mentioned sometime in his interview that they ran background checks for all of the survivors of the cult, but they couldn't find anything incriminating. Kyle asks Sweeney about the teeth marks on the victim's neck by the fence, and Sweeney explains to them that they ran a bunch of tests on the bite marks, and at first they thought it was an animal, but it came back to be this it came back to be human, but it was like a dead human. Sweeney continues to talk on about these old relics that he found, which are cloth fragments, which is important later. And he interviews one of Catherine's 7, Brother Belial, who is one of the main suspects of the case. All that Brother Belial mentions to them is that these cloth fragments come from these blood friends or old friends. And after all this time, there's still no trace of what happened in that case at the ranch, and the case went cold. And at this point you might be thinking, oh, we're finally getting something interesting. But nope. You still have to sit through 200 pages of exposition before you even get close. After another traveling montage, Kyle and Dan end up in a house in Seattle interviewing Martha Lakes. Now, Martha is probably the only person who actually gives them a lot of information, and I won't lie, it would have been interesting if it wasn't 40 pages long. To sum most of it up, Kyle mentions Prissy, who is one of the survivors of the cult. Prissy was impregnated at the cult, and one day she runs away to Emilio's father's ranch where she tries to save herself, but she forgets her baby, and so she eventually just goes back. She went back for her baby boy, couldn't get no further than that ranch. Broken heart brought her back to the mine, but she should have kept going. She should have gone straight to the police. And Kyle keeps asking her subtle questions about the cult, and Martha eventually is like, okay, cut the BS. You want to know the good stuff, right? Martha then goes on a whole monologue about all the awful things that Catherine had done to her followers, and how she would use anything as a weapon against them. Catherine just basically wore these people down until they were just shells of a person. Martha knew that Catherine was planning something awful, and so she made an escape plan to get out of there with her son. She talks about how Catherine had stolen her baby and Prissy's baby from her. One night, Prissy is sneaking out, and she decides to go check on her baby, who is in the nursery. And when she arrives, she realizes that her baby is gone, along with most of Catherine's 7 followers, who end up suspiciously coming back the next morning. Prissy unfortunately never sees that baby again. Main reason I left is because she stole a baby. Catherine. Oh yeah. Prissy's baby was gone one day from the shack when we called the nursery. Brothers Moloch and Ball must have took the boy to Catherine. We heard them leave in the VW van early one morning. Prissy snuck out like she always did to check on her little one in the nursery and saw that he was gone. Moloch and Ball came back to the mine late the next morning without the baby. I was shown photos by the police to identify the children they pulled out of there. Grieved by this, Prissy runs away and is presumed killed by the 7. We find out that the whole reason that Catherine had taken the babies was because she couldn't have children of her own. Finally, they bring up the blood friends again and their relationship to the case. In the cult, they would have, as Martha would call, these sessions, which basically a group of people would sit in a room and trip out on LSD. And just absolute crazy things would happen during these sessions. Everyone would somehow see the same horrible visions. Was a time where I saw Catherine walk a yard clear of the ground in the temple. She came out of her chair, calling out that they were among us. Another time, she showed us her sin coming out. And may I ask you, have you ever seen a woman or a man spit out frogs and these itty-bitty snakes out of their freaking mouths? Martha is then like, if you really want to see these blood friends, come with me. Martha goes on to lead them up to her attic, where they see that the same mold is growing on her ceiling. Martha explains that this is what Catherine had brought down on them. So these mold things are some sort of like portal, I'm assuming, to this other dimension where these creatures are, based on what Martha says. At the end of her interview, Martha also mentions something very important. She mentions that she had gotten the same fluorescent lights that Max had in his apartment, and they have been able to act as like some sort of ward to fight off these blood friends. These come 2 nights back, nearly made it all the way through, but I switched the lights on that Max sent me, and... Lights? What lights, Max? Dan said. Martha nodded without looking at him. It don't matter none. They just keep coming. Last night they chewed through the wires in there like rats, with what they got left for teeth. So after the interview, Martha pulls Dan aside and tells him about this other film crew that Max had hired to film this documentary, and the director's name is Malcolm. Now, I don't believe that Malcolm is important to the plot, other than making the book longer than it needs to be. And apparently I think Malcolm was some sort of competitor to Kyle. I'm not really sure. I don't really think it's that important. All you need to know is that Kyle and Malcolm are beefing, and that Malcolm had quit the job with no explanation, and that Max didn't tell Kyle. So now Kyle and Dan are kind of skeptical of Max and wondering if Max is using them for something. After that, they head home, they go to the pub, have more hallucinations and crazy visions. There's also something about Charles Manson's family in there, and I'm pretty positive that's kind of irrelevant to the plot, so I'm just gonna skip over that. When I tell you guys there is so much useless info dumping in here, I'm not kidding. At this point of the book, Kyle is sort of going manic, and Dan is like, why are we even doing this if it's making you like this? And Kyle in response is like, you don't believe me? Like, you don't believe that my visions are real? And Dan is like, no, but like I said, you're into this balls deep, and I'm not. So after their little argument, they try and reach out to Malcolm to see why he really rejected the job. And so they go to bed, and Kyle in the middle of the night wakes up in a sweat, and he notices that all of the lights are off, but he left them on because of Martha's warning. But now, he sits in the dark. Suddenly, there's a bump on the wall, and Kyle turns around to the doorway, where he sees a thin, shadowy figure drop to the floor. Now, if I'm not wrong, this is the first paranormal encounter that Kyle has with these blood friends, and we're on page 330. Anyways, in shock, Kyle tumbles over and he tries to find the light switch for the lights that Max gave him. But when he's flipping the switch, the lights just refuse to come on. He hears this thing come up to the foot of the bed, and just before he swung his legs over the side of the bed to flee blindly for the bathroom, he saw the faint, narrow face of the intruder peer over the ruffle of bed linen at him. More of a maw than a mouth hung open, as if to gulp at air or utter a shriek of joy. Finally, some action. Thank you. After this, Kyle books it to the bathroom, and he looks back one more time to see this demon tearing up his bed linens in his room, and he locks himself in the bathroom for the entire night. Also, just throwing this in there, Dan is like peacefully sleeping in the room next door, as if nothing is happening, and Kyle throughout the night is just like screaming for Dan to help him, and he's just dead asleep, like The next morning, Kyle doesn't mention anything to Dan, even though his room looks a mess. Like, this thing tore through everything, and they're just like, yeah, let's check out. And the fact that Dan is skeptical at this point in the book just bewilders me. You literally witnessed so many weird things up to this point, and you're still in denial about the fact that there's something supernatural about this cult. And he's just like, well, there's gotta be a logical explanation for all of this. Like, shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Anyways, they head back to London as they're still trying to get in contact with Malcolm, which is not going too well, so they just decide to stop by his place uninvited because they can't get a hold of him. His flat was the only one with a name card inserted under the grimy plastic buzzers, suggesting that he was the sole occupant of this miserable building, forgotten in its deprived pockmark of South London. They reach his apartment and call his room, and after a little persuasion, Malcolm lets them in his apartment. Now, Now, as soon as Kyle and Dan open the door, they are just mesmerized by their surroundings. There is just trash everywhere in his apartment. There's caffeine pills, there's beer bottles, there's food bags. It's everywhere. Day before I quit, which was about a month ago, there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing but use max lights in daylight. They don't get it. Gonal looked up at the ceiling and shouted, "You bastards!" And after this, Malcolm drops the bombshell that Martha Lakes is dead. Kyle again is like, something suspicious is going on here. I think Max is using us. Like, no duh. At this point, Malcolm's going crazy, he's yelling, he's throwing stuff, and he's telling Kyle that he should not sleep. Don't sleep. And Kyle's like, okay, this man is crazy, let's get out of here. The same day, Kyle and Dan visit Gabriel, who basically spills the beans and says that Max has been using the film crew to trigger all of these paranormal events to happen. After hearing about this, Kyle goes straight to Max. And Max is like, there's an explanation for all of this, just calm down. And his explanation for it is that this is all part of Catherine's revenge for the cult betraying her. Kyle's just not having it, and he thinks Max is just pulling his leg. Kyle is like, Catherine is dead though, how is that possible, even after everything he's been through? And he's like, just cut it out, just tell me what's going on, like I don't care at this point, just tell me. And Max is like, teehee, I can't tell you yet, and basically bribes Kyle to go fly out to Belgium where all will be explained. And to ensure that Kyle does this, he gives him his payment early. And Max explains that there's this painting that these rich people that we haven't heard of until now own. Kyle at this point is like, what? Why are you sending me out to go look at this painting? What is the importance of this? Like, our lives are in danger. And Max is like, yes, that is exactly what I'm doing, and you will go do it, because I won't tell you anything more. And so Kyle goes to fly out to Belgium to go look at this painting. And when he does, the security around it is pretty crazy. Kyle meets up with this, like, museum guard kind of person. I don't really know. His name is Peter, though. Peter takes Kyle to go see these paintings called The Saints of Filth, which are these 3 paintings composed of horrific imagery, which is supposedly going to explain everything that's going on with the cult. The first painting is of a battlefield. Kyle glanced at Peter, who nodded at the canvas. Tell me what you see. Kyle looked to the top of the first ancient wooden frame and moved his eyes downward. He saw a thin strip of a distant sky, red and black, cut above an arid plain of dry or scorched land. In the top third of the picture, beneath the angry sky, an army bristled with pikes and lances. Their steel helmets were close together, and the armored cluster moved as one mass upon the mostly broken wall. About the rubble inside a town, handful of men with thin legs threw their arms up into the sky, or stood with drawn swords or banners. It looked like a final stand. The second painting is of a marketplace on fire. Now look at the next painting, The Martyring of Fools. The market square filled the entire canvas and was depicted in much greater detail. A dirty, rubbish-strewn space of wet stone and poor light. Either the painting was filthy with age, or dark, greasy smoke had deliberately conjured to drift across the area and stain into the background. The flagstones were littered with the dead and undying. Faceless figures in dark steel armor formed a border about the slaughter. But the apex of the picture's images concentrated on a series of upright poles with things attached to their upper lengths. And the last painting is of the infamous unholy swine. And now we come to the end with The Kingdom of Fools. Rising to the upper margin of the gray charred sky in the third painting, a single figure immediately captured Kyle's attention. The pig clutched a scepter in one uncomfortably prehensile trotter in one hoof, and a gilt-edged book in another trotter. But what most unnerved him about the pig was its apparent glee at the elevation, or even the levitation, while it seated upon its throne. Up it went into the broiling maelstrom of the heavens, the air now depicted an unpleasant, sulphurous yellow mist. The pig and its host rose above the suggested miniature detail of a blackened town, crowded with smoke at the foot of the piece. Up into the sky, the host of tormented, stricken martyrs writhed, thin, wretched forms of at least 100 naked human figures. It honestly just seems like I'm saying random words at this point, but the last painting is basically the only important one because it depicts the Blood Friends and their ascent to hell. And what Kyle got from this is that the Blood Friends are basically reincarnations of all the cult members. Who would have guessed? Who would have guessed? Did you guess it? I didn't guess it. I mean, I did, but yeah. Anyways. After wasting time to go see this painting, he goes home and finds out that Dan is missing. And he goes into his room and finds his room is trashed. And Kyle's like, oh my god, and immediately reaches for his cigarettes, which is really funny. And then he just goes to the pub. But anyways, the Blood Friends had come through the ceiling and snatched Dan up while Kyle was gone. Kyle then goes back to Max to ask, where did my friend go? But as he reaches the door to Max's penthouse, it is flung open and Max looks absolutely awful. Kyle asks Max, like, what's going on? And Max says that the Blood Friends came for him while Kyle was gone. Kyle tells Max that the Blood Friends had come for Dan as well, and Max is like, oh, really? 'Cause Gabriel's dead. And that's kind of the end of that conversation. And Max goes on to tell Kyle that the only reason that he sent him to go see the paintings was so that he will finally believe. As if he didn't already. You saw them, the Saints of Filth. It's why I wasted so much time sending you there. So you really know what we're facing. So you can truly accept them. So that was just a waste of time for all of us. For me, for Kyle, and for anybody else who had read this book. And then Max says that there is only one way where they can be saved. This part of the book is just mostly info dumping, and I'm gonna be honest, I kind of blanked out, so just strap in and bear with me. Max starts out by telling how every single member of the cult had died. And when I say every single member, I do mean every single member, which I'm going to skip over because it was just a bunch of names and date, which I immediately forgot about. Max goes on to tell Kyle how odd it was that most of the higher up members of the cult were never found after the night of the massacre on the ranch, because he admits he spent a good majority of his life looking for them. He goes on to list a bunch of other dead people, and he finally mentions that Catherine has come back for revenge. Now, this is the part of the book where it gets a little bit confusing because Max brings up this swimwear actor model named Chet Regal, and how he's actually the child of Prissy, who Catherine had stolen. Now, on the night of the massacre, Max believes that Catherine's soul had transferred to Prissy's baby. So this Chet guy is actually Catherine. Kyle is like, what are you talking about? What's going on? I don't even know what's going on. But Max is like, oh no, this isn't the first time this reincarnation has happened. And it actually dates back to the 1500s with this guy named Lorch. So basically, this guy had created this ritual, and he's been reincarnating over the many, many years that he's been on the earth. And he now resides in the body of Chet. We think Lorch also intended to exchange body and mind with one of his children in Saint Maine in 1566. One of the children he kept isolated so he could live again. The other children were to serve as hosts for the spirits he served. Kyle again is like, there's no way any of this is real, like, you're starting to make stuff up. And Max is like, the only reason I asked you to film this documentary is to save us from Catherine's wrath. And that is to assassinate Chet Regal. And Kyle's like, oh, okay, so like, who's gonna go do that? And Max is like, you. Oh. Max tells Kyle that now is the time to strike because Chet is vulnerable right now due to a lost court case from his divorce. And he tells Kyle that he needs to be prepared. Prepared for what, you might ask? Chet has a pet tiger. Because why not? Rightfully so, Kyle just walks out the door to go find Dan. And he basically gives Max the middle finger and is like, do it yourself. I mean, why couldn't he do it himself? Max is rich and he has the money to hire an assassin who would probably do a much better job than a filmmaker. Kyle then, instead of looking for Dan, goes home to cry like a little baby. But anyways, his plan is to send all of his footage to Fingermouse. And I bet you forgot about him. And just to give up and wait for the blood friends to come for him. Just then, from inside the wall, he hears a rat and a scratching sound, along with a bang coming down from the first floor. And he's like, oh shit, here we go again. And so he grabs a hammer and a flashlight to try and kill this blood friend. And so the lights flicker and turn off, and so he eventually goes out and tries to find the fuse to restore the power to the building. Kyle is creeping down the second floor landing, and he peeks over the edge. Down in the darkness, he heard a joint crack, a knee, an ankle, maybe a metatarsal. He was not alone. His fingers trembled around the torch handle, still couldn't bring himself to switch it on. Doubted he could withstand what might reveal down there. Fingernails raked at the plastic. The fuse box, maybe? It snuffled, it whined, feet bumped, a low animal cry. A gargle of phlegm behind it. And then the lights went out in his flat. A sheet of total darkness covered him. And so he switches on the flashlight, and the blood friend, of course, hears him and sprints after him. And in a split second before he turned away, Kyle saw much more than he wanted to. Much more. Weeds of hair straggled from a wet skull. Brownish knees clacked together in the dark. There was a suggestion of a tattered linen, stained brown, hanging from a pelvis. Kyle stumbled into the doorway of his flat. He heard the lean form moving in the stairwell. Jerky and ungainly, it patted itself along the wall, felt for the miracle of solidity that appeared before its milky eyes and dim sight. And then Kyle books it back to his room, almost closing the door behind him as the creature pushes back. Kyle manages to get it latched, and then he runs around his apartment to try and find a way of escape, and he realizes that the only way out is through his window, and so he jumps out of his window. And I guess this encounter was enough to convince Kyle to assassinate Chet, because a couple days later, Max and Kyle and this other dude are sent away to San Diego to assassinate Chet. Just to show y'all for reference before we move on, this is how far we are in the book. This is how much we have left. We are on page 459, and we have about more or less 60 or 70 pages left. Okay, this is the final stretch. We're almost there. So Max then gets in touch with his private agent named Jed, who is that other guy, and he becomes pretty important to the story for some reason, even though we're almost done with the book. And this is the first time we're actually hearing about him. But basically, Jed is the man who did everything that Kyle didn't do. Max thought highly of Jed. Jed found the children of the mine. Jed had put Chet's mansion under surveillance for 3 months. Jed had tracked down everyone Kyle and Dan interviewed in the States. Jed got things done, and Jed had guns, but Jed made Kyle nervous. I'm confused because if Jed was so important for this plot, why wasn't he introduced earlier? That's my question. And so as they're going throughout the game plan and trying to figure out what they're gonna do, they start talking about Spielberg, which somehow Jed ends up talking about Stalin and Hitler for like 5.5 pages. And I'm only telling you this just to show you a little bit about just the random information that's put in this book, because I feel like sometimes it's a little bit unbelievable. So then Kyle wakes up from another nightmare to some chattering going on in the bathroom. And the lights are off in his hotel, and so he's like, oh no, what's happening? And so he stumbles to the bathroom door where he hears Max and Jed talking. And Max opens the door for him and is like, Kyle, get in here, we have to show you something. And when he gets into that bathroom, Kyle is immediately hit with a horrible stench. And he sees that in the bathtub, Jed and Max had caught one of the blood friends. At the sight of him, in what was left of the black eyes, a savage energy animated the cadaverous face under the bath taps into a sudden roar. that made the three of them step backwards. Emancipated legs kicked at them. The hideous strength of the intruder seemed to have gathered again. And what do? They kill it. But Kyle forgets to record it. A few moments later, Jed and Max are unscrewing light bulbs, I guess to draw more of them in. And Kyle is finally like, why am I here? Why did you bring me along? And Max, in response, just asks him if he just wants to die, because that's what's gonna happen if he doesn't follow along. And so that shuts Kyle up. And then he starts thinking about everything so far that has happened while filming. About Dan, about the blood friends, about Martha. And Kyle is finally like, guys, I can't do this. I'm not cut out for this. And Jed is basically like, well, you're already in too deep, so you have no choice. And Kyle says, Max, are you hearing this? Who is this clown? And that genuinely made me giggle a little bit, because what are you, 15? In response, Jed backhands him so hard that Kyle goes flying across the bed. I personally don't really hate Kyle that much, but that did feel good to read. Cause I mean, somebody had to do it. I couldn't listen to him complain one more time. Finally, Max steps in and is like, okay, break it up, y'all. And then a bunch of other things happen, like Kyle suddenly gets a phone call from Dan, which is weird because Dan is still missing, but it turns out to just be this lady at the hospital who is calling to let him know that Dan is okay. So Dan is alive. Kyle then tells the nurse to tell Dan to go to Fingermouse to, I'm assuming, upload the footage. Finally, we're wrapping things up and the trio sit out of Chet's mansion in a van. Max brings up Chet's pet tiger again, which was sent away to an animal sanctuary. So what was even the point of putting that in there? This book just gives you information 1 second and then just throws it out the window the next. So they start creeping up the long driveway up to his mansion and notice that the whole house is filled with blackout curtains. They reach the patio and Jed pulls out a glass cutter as they enter through the dining room and they bring out their night vision goggles. Max tells Kyle to start filming for their safety, which I don't think would do anything, but go ahead. But he films anyways as they walk through the mansion room from room. Suddenly, when they near a giant marble staircase, they start smelling that really gross smell again. And so, just to be safe, they clear the whole first floor before moving up to the second one where they start to hear this whining sound. And as they shine a light towards the end of the corridor, something scampers from one room to the next. So Jed takes the lead, moving deeper into the mansion. And suddenly, Max and Kyle hear a thud and Jed's flashlight goes out. Instinctively, Max just starts shooting rounds in the air as one of the blood friends move in to take them out. And just as it's about to swipe, Jed comes in and saves the day and shines a light in its face, making the blood friend cower back. He stomps on its neck and puts a bullet in its head. Max goes on to explain to them their behavior as they continue to sweep the floor for more of the blood friends. They mimic life, which means they have been here for long enough to copy what they once were. They're being sustained. Sustained how, Max? Jed called back. By the darkness? I don't know, but a lack of light wouldn't be enough to keep them here. In my rooms, they would come and go within minutes. So basically, something is keeping them alive in the physical realm. Because they've made so much noise now, they have awokened basically the hive. Because a lot of the blood friends just start showing up and attacking them. So they light up a flare to get a bearing of their surroundings. Something on all fours, as thin and naked as the embalmed corpse of an Egyptian priest Kyle had once seen in a British museum, crouched down and clawed at its face about 30 feet ahead of them. Behind him, the suggestion of other thin silhouettes, although it is impossible to deduce how many in the encroaching darkness, retreated like crabs from the flare. Terrible shrieks and hoots filled the corridor. So they kind of realize that they're being cornered, and Max is still like, this is our only chance, we have to go through with it. So Jed is hyping them up and he's like, okay, game plan. Max in the middle, you pick the tail, Spielberg, you holler if you see anything. And boys, ceilings and doors, eyes everywhere. And so they reach the second floor lobby, which is the room of the Great Birthing. This room basically looks like something out of Alien with like goo everywhere and the walls walls just filled with mold. Max hears something in the distance and just starts firing rounds again. And Jed is like, stop, we need to save our ammo, we only have a limited amount. So they continue looking for Chet on the second floor, where they come across a room with two elderly ladies sitting in it. They both have blood bags attached to them, basically enabling the blood friends to feed off of them. And so it describes them as looking very shriveled up, kind of like an empty Capri Sun. From the room next door, they start hearing a child who is in distress. And so Jed and Max pull out their Glocks and are like, oh yeah, let's go kill this child. And Kyle's like, you can't go kill a child, this isn't what I agreed on. But he throws himself at Jed to protect the child, and Jed falls down. But of course it's a trap, and the infant cries turn into canine growls as the infant jumps on Jed and kills him. And it's not looking good for Kyle and Max, who now hear galloping down the hallway. So Max books it the other direction, grabbing Jed's gun in the way and shooting blindly behind him. And Kyle is kind of smart for this, but he stays in the room and waits for the creatures to rush by the room. And now Kyle is in complete darkness, so he pulls out his camera and turns on the night vision mode, revealing some of the blood friends feasting upon Jed's dead body. And slowly he creeps out of the room and turns toward the staircase, where he sees Max being suspended in midair. A thing the size of a bear on its hind legs now held the executive producer's small body aloft, away from those others that Kyle was grateful he could not see in greater detail. Additional snarls and cackles and cries of bestial delight issued from the scrum of small emancipated silhouettes to fill the second-floor lobby, and accompanied the sounds of wet leather strops and grizzle pops that emerged from whatever was being done to Max's diminutive body. Rest in peace, Max. I never really liked you. Kyle, of course, is like, okay, this is the end. This is where I'm gonna die. So he just returns to the room from which he came in. Frantically, he gathers himself and tries to calm himself down. And he goes back out into the hall to look for Chet to end this nightmare once and for all. So Kyle is going from door to door, trying everything he can to find Chet, until he comes across this one door and he opens it. From within the room, he sees quite an odd scene. Within the middle of the room, there's this plastic clear tent, and within the tent is a big bed, and over the bed, suspended in midair, is Chet's body. And around this tent are the corpses of countless people who are sitting in white chairs, shriveled and decaying. Guys, this is the final showdown. We have finally reached it. Behind him, the blood friends are banging on the door, and as a last resort, he lights his last flare. From underneath the bed linen, Kyle sees a small child resting, and so he takes his gun and he shoots Chet. And Chet falls from the air and he dies. With the bullet holes, Kyle rips through the tarp and steps through the tent. And the little boy cowers in the corner as Kyle puts more rounds into Chet's head just to make sure he's dead. And as the last life of Catherine slips away from Chet's body, everything around Kyle goes silent. The noises have stopped. All that is left in the mansion is Kyle and this little boy. Kyle had filmed it all. He won. He can finally go home now. Kyle then walks out of the mansion and calls paramedics so they can rescue the boy, and everything turns out okay. Wow. Guys, we did it. We finally finished the book. After 531 painfully long pages, we finished the book. Now, this book was definitely tough to get through, but do I think it was bad? I genuinely did think the premise of this book was pretty interesting, and I was really excited when I started to read it. But I do think that the book could have been cut down 100 or 200 pages. I think there was just a little too much exposition that the author really didn't need to put in there. Overall, did I enjoy this book? Not really. Do I think I could have enjoyed it? Probably. And again, I did kind of skim through the book again, so I might have missed something very important. And if I did, just feel free again to correct me or add it in whatever I missed, because there was no way I was going to be reading this whole thing again. I do have to appreciate this author just for a second, because I don't think I could write this in-depth of a book. Overall, he did a pretty decent job. I have heard that his book, The Ritual, is very good, and I haven't read it yet, but it's on my reading list. So eventually I will get to that book. But the reason that I started reading this book was actually because of the ritual. Other than that, that's kind of all I have to say about Last Days. I hope you guys enjoyed this little video. I do have a couple of ideas for my next video. I'm thinking either of doing a review of Playground by Aaron Beauregard, or I'm gonna be reading the Game of Thrones series, so just let me know what y'all would want next. Anyways, with that being said, I hope you have an amazing day or night, and I will see you in the next one.